A new bill introduced in both houses of the legislature would eliminate more than 100 state authorities that the measure's sponsors insist no longer serve any purpose. Now, most of these are defunct, but nevertheless remain on the state's books. The authority's budget office pegs the number of non-functioning authorities considerably higher, actually, perhaps even as high as 160, and has drafted its own elimination legislation. Now, to a layperson, it probably seems pretty obvious that either of these bills would be a good first step towards downsizing the state government, which of course is a priority for Governor Andrew Cuomo. But we figured we would call in an expert to help us out. So before departing the Assembly last year, Richard Brodsky spearheaded the effort to create more oversight of public authorities, or as he likes to call them, Soviet-style bureaucracies. Richard, thanks very much for your time.
Nice to be back with you, Liz.
It is great to see you. So actually, before you left the Assembly, you had a bill that would have gotten rid of some of these defunct authorities.
That was the second part. What we actually had done is we passed into law the most across-the-board profound reform of state government in 50 years, the Authority Reform Act.
Right.
And that set up a process where the newly created authorities budget office told us which authorities simply didn't function anymore. They had no officers, they had no activity, they had no finances. And what this bill does, and there were similar bills last year, Sam Hoyt had one, is it gets rid of the low-hanging fruit. I mean, this is easy.
Right.
This doesn't really downsize government. This cleans up the books.
Okay, but before we go any further, hold on. How many, if we're talking about 100 entities, I mean, are they just shells hanging around? Are they actually costing the taxpayers any money? Okay, all right, so they're just out there.
No, they're not costing anybody anything. They don't function. They had specific purposes at one point. Some were a local IDA that doesn't function anymore, or a development corporation. So this is easy. I mean, this is obvious. This is like the back of your hand. What's tougher is when you get to functioning authorities, whether you want to collapse them into one larger authority or not. Keep in mind that these, there are two ways to think about this. You want to downsize the number of organizations, that's one way. The other is you want to provide less service, and that's the other way. And there's been a muddying of that. At some point, I think we're going to look at some of these things and say we just don't want the services they provide anymore because we can't afford them or they're unnecessary.
Okay, but shouldn't we also say, though, that at some level authorities are positive? I mean, if you get rid of them all, then there can't be any borrowing anymore. I mean, it's hard for the state is already leveraged out, you know, the window is the problem, right? Authorities have the ability to borrow money and do projects faster than the state itself can.
I'm not sure it's faster, but they certainly can borrow differently. When the state borrows, it pledges its full faith and credit.
Right.
That is the taxpayers' money. Authorities borrow without recourse to taxpayers. So it's called revenue bonding. It's very much necessary. It's like the Thruway Authority. If the Thruway Authority goes belly up, taxpayers aren't on the hook to pay off the bondholders whose money was used to build the Thruway. So although it gets technical, what you can say with some reliability is the state has pretty much stopped borrowing. The state has downsized its workforce, and at the same time, public authorities have dramatically increased their borrowing and dramatically increased their workforce, some for good stuff and some for crazy stuff. You wouldn't have been able to build the new $4 billion Yankee Stadium without the IDA of the city of New York. So they're used sometimes below the radar, sometimes above, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. When we passed the reform bill, we finally began a process that's getting our arms around it. And this bill to eliminate the non-functional authorities is that first little but desirable step to getting our arms around a system that was really out of control.
Yeah, we call that backdoor borrowing, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you know,
well, you can. A lot of the borrowing that is done by authorities is backdoor borrowing. A lot is revenue borrowing. A lot is different kinds of borrowing. Television isn't the place for these long technical explanations. What you can say is that they were Soviet-style bureaucracies. That phrase really, I think, concentrated a lot of the conclusions we drew about it.
So, Richard,
and now we're bringing them back under control.
So, Richard, in the last report that you authored on authorities prior to leaving office in 2010, you said that more information about authority operations than was currently available is necessary to actually determine how many of these things are needed and where they could actually be merged.
Right.
We're talking about 700 authorities. That is an enormous shadow government.
Let's take a county that has more than one IDA, Industrial Development Agency. Do they really need 3 sets of officers, 3 boards?
No.
Or can they all work through one? But when you finally do that, you are consolidating services, not just organizations.
Right.
And that's why we said they've really got to figure out what matters. Should we have in the metropolitan area, for example, the MTA plus the Suffolk County Bus Authority plus the Westchester bus system, all with separate governance structures? Now, there are reasons that you want to do that. You get perhaps more responsive government, but it can be expensive, can be unnecessary.
So let me ask you this
It's real reform, and real reform is always more difficult, more detailed, more nudgy than the broad sweeping generalizations that we do at the beginning of that process.
The governor has a commission. It's called the SAGE Commission, right? And I'm sure you're aware of it. It's looking at the government consolidation. It's looking at where we're going to have to make this consolidation and streamlining. Are you expecting that, in fact, there will be a broad overhaul of authorities? And if there isn't, can you actually call it streamlining government if you don't seriously reduce the number of 700 authorities?
You can reduce the number and it will be streamlining, and you can reduce the number and it won't be streamlining, because what you've got to get people to focus on isn't the fact that there are these organizations around, it's whether or not you can get the services delivered more swiftly and less expensively. That's a very complicated operational analysis. You have the Port Authority of the state of New York and of New Jersey, and you have the MTA, both in the transportation business. They both do things. Maybe only one organization would be needed. But that's not a matter of slogans. That's a matter of looking at the day-to-day operations of both entities and figuring out what you can do to do more with less.
Okay.
Keep in mind, public authorities aren't under the governor's control.
Right.
They're independent bodies, not part of the executive branch. Life is complicated, Liz. This is complicated. But we started a process that's going to pay off in less institutions, better service, less borrowing, a more responsible government.
Okay, this is the world according to Richard Brodsky. When the SAGE Commission actually comes out with some kind of report and recommendations, we will have you back to analyze that, because I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say now that you're unfettered and no longer afraid of what you might say to anyone.
It scares me to death, Liz, but I'm a journalist, and I don't know how I sleep at night.
Me neither, actually. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.